leaders, if we can call them that. I'm talking about people more like Truss, who served for at least a couple of weeks, and so in theory, we have the capacity to analyze their administration as we would analyze the administration of any other leader. People who were around long enough to have done at least a few things, as opposed to nothing. So that means putting aside the people who served for incredibly brief terms explicitly because they were supposed to be transitional or interim leaders, like that woman who served as president of South Africa for just a few hours because the previous president resigned too early in the morning for Parliament to be able to reconvene and elect a new one. I also don't want to talk about leaders who may have initially served a very brief term but then came back and served a longer term later on. This sort of thing is very common in parliamentary countries where leaders often serve multiple non-consecutive terms. For example, I believe that the two men who served as the shortest serving prime ministers of Italy and Japan both came back and served more substantial terms later on. No, instead I want to talk about short-serving leaders whose short term was the only term they ever served, and thus the term that defines their entire legacy as leader. I mean, I guess I'm sort of jumping the gun a bit on Truss here. It's theoretically possible that she could come back someday and be the longest serving prime minister in British history, but I will take that gamble. Before we begin, let us just hear a quick word from today's video sponsor, Helix Mattresses. So as I said, I have been traveling around a fair bit, and sleeping in all of these different random beds has certainly made me miss my charming loft bed back home and my fabulous Helix mattress. If you're in the market for a new mattress, Helix has you covered. Just click your way through their little sleep quiz and answer a few questions about the manner in which you sleep. You know, whether you sleep on your side or your back or whatever, and how much back pain you have, and Helix will tell you which one of their customized mattresses is the best pick for you. I initially got a Dusk, which is in the middle grade of softness, but then I decided I wanted something a little bit firmer, so I got a Twilight instead, which is both harder and apparently better for side sleepers, which I have realized I am. And it was all possible because Helix has a wonderful return policy where you get a 100-day sleep trial, followed by free return or exchange, including pickup. Other perks of Helix include 10-year warranty, financing options, and flexible payment plans, free shipping within the US. And get this, if you order using the link in the thing below or this URL, you get $200 off your initial purchase, and not one, but 2 free pillows. Wow. So don't delay, say no to soulless big box mattress stores, and yes to personalized shrink wrap delivery straight to your doorstep. Don't worry, Helix Mattress, I'll be home soon. So the shortest serving president of the United States is, I think, a fairly well-known guy, William Henry Harrison. He's a bit like Truss in that he got the job by actively campaigning for it. But unlike Truss, he wasn't just elected by his party, but rather the American public at large in the general election of 1840. So clearly, he was at least a somewhat significant figure in American political history, as any man who gets elected president invariably is. Harrison is sometimes mentioned as being the first president who was sort of marketed to the public in a somewhat modern way, in the sense that he wasn't previously someone who was super well known, but through clever advertising and PR, his campaign was able to turn him into this beloved character that everyone was super excited to vote for. In this case, Harrison's team effectively sold him as this great war hero, a man who had successfully led the charge against the hated Indians for control of the western frontier, and then against the equally hated British in the War of 1812. They pitched him as being like the second coming of George Washington, and it was thanks to the success of this marketing that he was able to get elected as the first ever president from the Whig Party, which was the big populist force in American politics back then. Harrison was so popular, in fact, that the Whigs were able to sweep both chambers of the US Congress in the 1840 election as well. Now, the standard way that Harrison's story is usually told is that he gave his inauguration speech in the bitter cold without wearing his jacket, and then he caught pneumonia and died like immediately after. But in reality, he didn't get fatally ill until like the 3rd week of his presidency. And modern medical researchers believe that he didn't in fact die of pneumonia at all, but rather some sort of stomach virus that he got from drinking infected water at the White House. So his 1-month presidency wasn't really defined by illness as much as it was defined by the sort of thing that tends to define the first month of most presidencies, which is making a bunch of big cabinet appointments. Since Harrison was the first Whig president, a lot of the big Whig politicians were really salivating to get the top jobs. The most consequential decision of his presidency was probably appointing Daniel Webster as Secretary of State, and thereby consolidating the power of the man who was already one of America's most powerful Whigs. When Harrison did eventually die, on the 31st day of his presidency, his vice president, John Tyler, took over. He was a man who had much weaker ties to the Whig Party, and he fought with the Whig leaders in Congress so much that a mere 6 months into his own presidency, he was actually kicked out of the party. And all of the Whig cabinet people that Harrison had appointed quit the administration in disgust. So in that sense, Harrison's short presidency might be most relevant for basically preventing what it was supposed to deliver, namely a coherent 4 years of Whig party rule. Now, in the wake of Liz Truss's resignation, a bunch of you guys have been messaging me about Kim Campbell, who is fairly well known for being an infamously short-serving Prime Minister of Canada at just 4 months. But since I already made a whole award-winning video about her, I thought that today we would instead talk about the man who somehow managed to serve as Prime Minister of Canada for an even shorter period of time. Prime Minister Charles Tupper, who served for only 71 days. So Tupper can actually be said to be one of Canada's founding fathers, in the sense that he was heavily involved in the drafting of the 1867 Canadian Constitution. He did this in his capacity as the Prime Minister of Nova Scotia, which was one of the original 4 British colonies that got together to form the Canadian Confederation. Tupper would go on to serve as a senior cabinet minister in the Conservative government of Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, and from the start he was seen as a likely heir to take over someday. In 1888, Macdonald made Tupper ambassador to Great Britain, which was a very important job in those days because Canada was still part of the British Empire, and he liked that job so much he didn't want to leave England even after Macdonald died in office in 1891. Instead, these 3 other men each served as Prime Minister of Canada for a brief period of time. And these men are unto themselves some of Canada's shortest serving leaders, with their divisive and scandal-plagued administrations remembered for ushering in a uniquely unstable and chaotic period of Canadian government that lasted from 1891 to 1896. Tupper did eventually come home from England and rejoined the cabinet, hoping to establish order and competence. But by that point, a lot of the damage had been done, and the Conservative Party had become very unpopular and worn out. On April 24th, 1896, a general election was called, and a week later, the Conservative Party formally made Tupper their leader, and thus the incumbent Prime Minister. The hope was that he could persuade voters to give a fresh reboot to this tired government and party. But unfortunately for them, the opposition Liberal Party had also appointed a new leader, a guy called Wilfrid Laurier, who was one of the most talented politicians in Canadian history. Since Tupper was appointed Prime Minister during the course of the 1896 election campaign, his entire 10-week prime ministership was dominated by nothing other than running for re-election, meaning he literally didn't do anything with the office of Prime Minister except lose it. On June 23rd, 1896, Laurier beat the Conservatives by a big margin, but for the next 2 weeks, Tupper refused to accept the results of the election and tried to make a flurry of patronage appointments on his way out. He was vetoed by Canada's British governor, however. One of the few times in Canadian history that this sort of thing happened. All right, now let us leave the 19th century and tell one of the most infamous stories of a short-serving leader in the 20th. The story of John Paul I, who was Pope for just 34 days in 1978. John Paul I was the former Archbishop of Venice, who was elected Pope following the death of Paul VI. Like many papal elections, this outcome was a bit of a surprise. John Paul had never held a position within the Vatican bureaucracy and had never worked for the church outside of Italy, 2 of the most standard qualifications for popes. He was thus seen as a somewhat sheltered and even slightly naive outsider, in contrast to the 2 much more establishment and worldly popes who had come before him. Today, his short reign is remembered primarily for his unpretentious manner and friendly personality, which was visible during the few public ceremonies he did during his first couple of weeks on the job. The Smilin' Pope, they called him, which is a real testament to just how unemotional and austere the popes before him had been. Much like William Henry Harrison, the main legacy of John Paul I might just be the story of his inauguration. Before him, popes used to have these really elaborate coronation ceremonies, sort of like kings, where the pope was carried in on this portable throne and